Stop everything you're doing right now. Imagine a voice so urgent, so unshakable, that it cuts through the noise of your day and demands your full attention. That is the voice of President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. He does not whisper, he declares. And his words are not just for his people in West Africa. They are for you, for every man and woman in Black America, for every elder who remembers, and every youth searching for direction. This is not another speech about distant struggles or empty promises of hope. It is something far more piercing, a blueprint for liberation forged in fire, tested by history, and spoken with a clarity that leaves no room for excuses. Traoré begins with a question that should echo in your heart long after the video ends. What if everything you've been taught about your history, your limitations, and your place in this world was never truth but deliberate design? A design meant to keep you kneeling while others feast on your genius. Think about that for a moment. From the slave ships to Jim Crow, from colonial Africa to the ghettos of American cities, the same machine has worked tirelessly to break the bond between Africans at home and Africans in the diaspora. And yet we are still here, creating, resisting, rising. That survival, that refusal to vanish, terrifies the system more than any weapon ever could. But Traoré does not speak as a distant observer. He speaks as family. He recognizes the same fire in your eyes that burns in his, the fire that says enough. Enough of silence. Enough of division. Enough of living beneath the weight of lies that were never ours to carry. So the question comes to you, will you keep watching history repeat itself? Or will you answer the call to unity that could transform the future of generations yet unborn? If you believe the time for truth is now, stay with us until the very end. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to stand with President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you know that the truth matters more than the headlines. The heart of Ibrahim Traoré's message begins with an unflinching revelation: the greatest threat to African people, whether in Harlem or Ouagadougou, was never simply guns, chains, or even poverty. It was division. Division carefully engineered in boardrooms thousands of miles away, dressed up as progress and sold to the world as inevitability. He tells us plainly he has seen those meetings, the polished smiles behind closed doors, the carefully drawn maps that reduce living communities to pawns on a chessboard. He has watched as global powers ignite wars, topple leaders, strangle economies, and then preach democracy as if they were benevolent guardians. The cruelty, he insists, is not accidental. It is manufactured, exported, and maintained because it keeps Africans everywhere on their knees. And here is where the speech strikes its first deep chord. Traoré does not present the oppression of Black America and the oppression of Africa as separate stories. He shows them as two sides of the same coin flowing from the same poisoned source. Think about it. In the United States, a Black man pulled over by police lives under the constant threat of brutality. In Africa, a farmer lives under the constant shadow of corporations extracting his land's wealth while leaving his family in hunger. In American classrooms, children are taught a version of history that erases their ancestors' genius. In African villages, children are taught dependency on systems that exploit their resources. Police brutality in your city, resource theft in his village, educational apartheid in your schools, economic colonization in his lands. Different costumes, same poison. That is the central truth Traoré hurls like a thunderbolt. The system is global. It is coordinated. It is relentless. But even as he exposes this machinery, he reminds his audience that the oppressed have never been passive. He has seen ordinary men and women rise from being dismissed as powerless to becoming unstoppable forces of change. He reminds us that every march, every boycott, every whispered story of survival is proof that the chains of division are not unbreakable. He points to history as undeniable evidence. When Black Americans boycotted buses in Montgomery, it was not simply about seats. It was an economic earthquake that brought a system to its knees. When marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, their courage reverberated across oceans, inspiring Soweto in South Africa, Lagos in Nigeria, and even the favelas of Brazil. At the same time, Africa's struggles mirrored these fights. Nations bled under the weight of colonial borders and economic dependency, yet still resisted through liberation movements, through music, through culture that refused to die. What happened in Birmingham, Alabama was not isolated from what happened in Accra, Ghana. Each was a verse in the same unfinished song of freedom. Traore makes it clear this was never about geography, it was about control. The system's greatest invention was convincing the African in Mississippi that he had nothing in common with the African in Mali, that the struggles of black children in Chicago were somehow detached from the struggles of children in Burkina Faso. And so his speech strips away that illusion. He reminds his audience that their pain is connected, their oppressors are coordinated, and their liberation must be as well. This is why he insists that the most dangerous weapon of all was not the whip, the gun, or the noose. It was psychological programming. It was the lie of separation. It was teaching the oppressed to love their chains, to beg for crumbs at the tables built with their labor. By exposing this design, Traoré reframes the struggle. It is not a series of isolated injustices to be fought piecemeal. It is one machine, and it must be confronted as one. And here lies the seed of his radical claim. Once the oppressed understand their unity, once they remember that they are everything the world fears, no empire, no matter how wealthy, armed, or technologically advanced, can hold them. That is the foundation of his message. A revelation both terrifying and liberating. The enemy's strength has always been our disconnection. And the moment we see that clearly, history shifts. The speech rises to its fiercest point when Ibrahim Traoré shifts from exposing oppression to proclaiming the unstoppable power of resistance. His words throb with urgency, his tone no longer simply descriptive, but electric, carrying the weight of centuries into a single truth. They fear unity more than nuclear weapons. This line does not arrive gently. It bursts like thunder, shaking the frame of every listener's understanding. For decades, we have been told that armies, missiles, and sanctions are the ultimate levers of global power. But Traoré insists otherwise. The empire trembles not at weapons of war, but at the sight of oppressed people realizing their worth and standing as one. To prove this, he weaves history into his crescendo. He names the moments when ordinary black people transformed their pain into movements that rattled the pillars of power. The Montgomery bus boycott, simple in act, but seismic in effect, showed that even the smallest refusal can collapse an unjust system. The marches in Selma, the cries from Watts and Baltimore, the voices rising from Ferguson, all of these, Traoré reminds us, were never local outbursts. They were signals that carried across oceans, stirring echoes in Soweto's youth, in Lagos's streets, in São Paulo's favelas. This is the fire. He points to the same flame that ignited in every corner of the diaspora, burning, despite centuries of humiliation. It is not symbolic. It is tangible, visible in the art, music, and culture forged from suffering but transformed into brilliance. Jazz that healed, blues that spoke to the deepest wounds of the human spirit, hip-hop that evolved into a global cultural force shaping generations from New York to Nairobi. Traoré uses these examples not as nostalgia, but as evidence. Evidence that the system has already lost control whenever unity is achieved even briefly. And evidence that culture born from resistance is more powerful than propaganda, more enduring than policies designed to erase. But the climax of his message is not only historical, it is painfully present. He warns that the old tools of oppression have evolved into new forms far subtler but just as deadly. Where once there were chains, now there is psychological programming. Where once there were burning crosses, now there are algorithms shaping perception and opportunity. Where once there was segregation written into law, now there are economic policies that reproduce the same exclusion under the mask of globalization. This revelation forces the audience to confront a sobering truth: the fight never ended, it only changed form. The enemy no longer always comes with guns. They arrive with contracts, media campaigns, and digital systems that manipulate identity. Oppression today wears the suit of respectability, the smile of democracy, the disguise of philanthropy. And yet Traoré insists this should not lead to despair. Because just as the system adapts, so too can resistance. The very thing they fear most, unity across borders, across oceans, across generations, is the weapon no algorithm, no sanction, no empire can stop. The reaction he demands is not passive agreement, but awakening. He is not content with his audience nodding along. He presses them into reflection. You are not beggars. You never were, he declares, stripping away the centuries-old narrative that black people must plead for validation or inclusion. Instead, he crowns them heirs of civilizations, builders of nations, thinkers whose ideas shaped the very bedrock of humanity. This is the emotional peak of his speech. The humiliation of centuries is inverted into pride. What was dismissed as weakness is revealed as the very foundation of strength. What was called survival is reframed as proof of genius. By the time Traore reaches this point, his listeners cannot remain detached. The crescendo is designed to stir both memory and action, anger and hope. The recognition of exploitation is no longer enough. What is required is the courage to seize unity as a living weapon. And so the reaction he provokes is twofold. Among his African audience, it is the affirmation that their struggle is not isolated, that they are part of a global family scarred but unbroken. Among Black America, it is the haunting realization that their story too was never confined to U.S. borders. It has always been part of a larger battle. The climax leaves no space for neutrality. It forces a choice: remain scattered and controllable, or unite and become, in Traore's words, a storm no force on earth can withstand. When Ibrahim Traoré moves past the climax, he begins to lay bare the civil and political consequences of this struggle. His message is clear: disunity has a cost, and it is written into the daily lives of millions. But unity also has a reward, an inheritance waiting to be claimed. First, he dismantles the narrow identity often imposed on Black Americans. "You are not just Americans who happen to have dark skin," he insists. That label, though it appears harmless, is in fact a cage. It isolates, making people believe their struggles are purely domestic issues: police brutality, underfunded schools, employment, discrimination. By reframing identity, Traoré calls them to see themselves not as minorities trapped in someone else's system, but as heirs of a continent, descendants of civilizations whose brilliance predates the very empires that oppressed them. The civil consequence of this shift in perspective is profound. No longer can Black Americans view their pain as isolated episodes of injustice. They begin to see their story as bound to the same narrative that shapes the lives of farmers in Burkina Faso, miners in Congo, and youth in Lagos. Oppression ceases to be personal and becomes structural, systemic, and global. That recognition breeds solidarity, and solidarity fuels movements powerful enough to rewrite laws, redistribute resources, and reimagine futures. Politically, the consequences are even sharper. Traoré warns that the system thrives only so long as division persists. When diaspora communities believe Africa is hopeless, they invest elsewhere. When Africans are told African Americans are lost, they dismiss potential allies. These narratives protect the status quo, allowing the empire to continue exploiting both continents without challenge. But once those lies collapse, new possibilities emerge. Imagine Traoré suggests a world where Africa's sovereignty over its land and resources combines with the diaspora's networks, visibility, and economic influence. Together, they would form a force capable of challenging the dominance of international finance, rewriting the rules of trade, and creating independent institutions of justice and education. The societal ripple effects of such unity cannot be overstated. Communities, once resigned to survival, could begin to build. Schools could teach history not written for compliance, but for liberation. Economies could be structured to serve collective needs rather than foreign corporations. Health systems could prioritize healing over profit. These are not utopian dreams, but concrete outcomes of coordinated action. At the same time, Traoré acknowledges the cost of ignoring this call. If disunity continues, the cycle will remain unbroken. Black children in Detroit will still be fed stereotypes about their worth, while children in Dakar will still be taught dependency on outside saviors. Cities in America will still experience the violence of police militarization, while villages in Africa will still face the violence of resource plunder. Different symptoms, one disease. Without unity, that disease only mutates and grows stronger. For the West, the political consequence of African and diaspora unity would be nothing short of seismic. Their policies, their financial control, their cultural dominance all rely on keeping these populations disconnected. A conscious, coordinated unity would dismantle those mechanisms, undermining centuries of dominance. This is why Traoré argues empires fear solidarity more than armies. The civil and political stakes, then, are not abstract. They are urgent, immediate, and deeply personal. Will Black Americans continue to accept the narrative of isolation? Will Africans continue to accept dependency as inevitable? Or will both recognize that they are, in Traoré's words, not beggars, but builders? By reframing identity and exposing the cost of disunity, Traore leaves his audience with a stark truth: survival alone is not enough. What is required now is construction of schools, of systems, of movements, of futures. And that construction begins the moment civil awareness becomes political action, and political action becomes collective power. As Traore's words echo beyond Burkina Faso, they strike a nerve in Washington, London, and Brussels. The West has always understood something that the oppressed too often forget: unity between Africa and its diaspora is their greatest geopolitical fear. That is why Traore reminds us every attempt at building such bridges has been sabotaged. History offers painful evidence. Marcus Garvey's movement for a global black renaissance was crushed under surveillance and imprisonment. Patrice Lumumba's dream of a sovereign Congo was extinguished by assassination coordinated with foreign powers. The Black Panthers were infiltrated and dismantled. Malcolm X, who dared to internationalize the struggle of Black America by linking it to Africa, was silenced before his vision could mature. Each of these figures became targets not only because they were radical at home, but because they threatened to build bonds across the Atlantic. From the perspective of the United States, this is not merely cultural, it is strategic. For decades, American policymakers have relied on a predictable pattern. African nations remain dependent on aid and loans, while Black Americans remain confined within domestic civil rights battles. If those two fronts ever converge, America faces a challenge it has no blueprint to counter. Europe's anxieties are no less intense. The wealth of European nations was built on Africa's exploitation, from gold and diamonds to cotton and coffee. For centuries, Europe exported both resources and people, enriching itself while impoverishing the source. If Africa reclaims its sovereignty while simultaneously strengthening bonds with the diaspora, Europe risks losing not only economic leverage, but also moral authority in a rapidly shifting world. Globally, the consequences of Traore's vision are staggering. Imagine an African continent that controls its vast resources aligned with diaspora communities whose economic power in the West is measured in trillions of dollars. Imagine cultural solidarity turning into political influence in institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, or even within Western democracies where diaspora votes can sway elections. This is more than theory. It is a geopolitical nightmare for those who depend on fragmentation. But Traore frames it not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He insists that unity is not aimed at revenge or destruction. It is aimed at building systems of justice, dignity, and sustainability. Still, he does not shy away from naming the reality: Western powers will resist such unity because it exposes the fragility of their dominance. Old alliances are already cracking. Economic systems once considered unshakable are faltering. In this transition, the most organized and self-aware communities will set the course for the next century. For American audiences, especially older generations who lived through civil rights struggles, this global perspective carries both warning and hope. The warning that without solidarity, oppression will continue to adapt, ensuring that future generations inherit the same battles. The hope that by embracing Africa as family, not abstraction, Black America can step into a role history has been waiting for: leaders of a worldwide transformation. And for the wider world, the message is unmistakable. Africa is no longer a passive stage for global powers to play their games. Under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, it is becoming a voice of defiance, a center of innovation, and a partner that demands respect. The world must reckon with a rising Africa, not as charity case, but as equal. The choice then lies with the people. Will they answer this call for unity across oceans and borders, or will they let history's saboteurs win again? Traore leaves that question hanging, knowing full well that America, Europe, and the rest of the world are already paying close attention. Despite 4 centuries of chains, shipholds, plantations, segregation, and economic plunder, the people of Africa and her diaspora are still here, still breathing, still creating, still refusing to vanish. That, Traore says, is itself a victory. Yet he warns survival alone is no longer enough. Resilience cannot be the final chapter. The time has come not just to endure, but to build, and building requires clarity. The empire has no defense against unity. It can plan for climate disasters, economic crashes, even global wars, but it cannot stop a people who finally understand their worth and act together. That is why the system will do everything in its power to distract, divide, and deceive, to keep Africans and Black Americans apart, to keep generations trapped in cycles of survival instead of seizing the inheritance of strength. But the cracks in their order are widening. Old alliances crumble, economies once thought eternal now stumble, and new movements rise from below. The question Traore leaves us with is urgent. Will we cross the bridge of unity, or will we allow history's chains to be reforged once again? This is not charity, not pity, not another plea for inclusion. It is family calling family. A continent extending its hand not as beggar, but as builder. A diaspora with resources and influence, ready to connect with a homeland rich in land, culture, and destiny. Together, it is not just reunion, it is revolution. So I ask you, do you believe that unity between Black America and Africa is the true revolution the world fears? Can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré to guide this path, or must we prepare to raise up successors to carry the flame forward? Please share if you feel you are among the first to stand with President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth matters more than the headlines. The time is now. The bridge is waiting. Will you cross it?